Anthony Morganti, I am MrPhotographer.com. In this next series of videos, I'm going to go over all the different menu settings that are found in the Nikon Z6. Most of these settings will also apply to the Nikon Z7. Now, I mentioned that it's a series of videos. That's because I think there's just too many settings to try to squeeze into one super long video. Also, I'm not going to go in order. I'm not going to start at the top in the playback menu and work our way through. I'm going to start where I think the settings are most important to you. I'm going to be assuming you purchased the Z6 or Z7 to take pictures. And you're probably going to start out in this photo shooting menu. So we're going to start there. Also, this is probably going to be our longest video, so please bear with me. Now, right at the top, reset photo shooting menu. If you just want to reset everything that's in this menu back to their default settings, you could do that. Keep in mind that this only resets all these settings that are in this menu. It doesn't reset the entire camera. Next is the storage folder. You probably know on your memory card, your images are stored in a folder. By default, the folder is going to have the name NCZ_6. You could rename that to any 5-character name you'd like. Right there. Also, the prefix to the folder name will be a folder number. You could have multiple folders that you shoot to, and you could have them numbered any way you wish. By default, you start with number 100, and then you work your way 101, 102, and so forth. But you could do any 3-digit number you'd like. Now, if you do have more than one folder on your memory card, this is where you would choose which folder to use. Why would you want more than one folder? Well, maybe you're a wedding photographer and you're shooting multiple weddings and you don't have time to remove the images from the card at first. And you'll shoot one wedding to one folder and another wedding to another folder. Or maybe you're a landscape photographer who also takes portraits. You could shoot your landscapes to one folder, your portraits to the other folder, and you could do that here. Just choose which folder you'd want to shoot to here. You can see I have 2, so if I want to shoot to this folder now, I just select that, and I'll be shooting to that folder. Now you probably know that inside of that folder you have files, and your files have names. Now, if you're shooting to the sRGB color space or with the sRGB color space, and I'll talk more about color spaces in a moment, the file name is DSC underscore with the actual number of image. If you're shooting to the Adobe RGB color space, it's underscore DSC with the number of image. You could change that DSC to any 3-character name you'd like right here. I just use the default DSC. Choose image area. Now it's a full frame camera, so it's a FX camera as Nikon calls it. And the full frame sensor is 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and that's what I choose to shoot to. But if you want to shoot to the DX or crop sensor, you can do that as well. Shoot a square image, you could do that. Or you could shoot a 16:9 ratioed kind of video output shot. You may do that as well. I leave it at FX. Next is the actual image quality. You have really 3 different types of images you could shoot to. A RAW file, which is a NEF file in Nikon's world, a JPEG image, or a TIFF image. If you want to shoot to TIFF, you'd have to go all the way down to the bottom. And there's TIFF. Now you'll notice there's a lot of different JPEG choices, and also you could shoot a combination of RAW and JPEG. Those JPEG choices are fine, normal, and basic, with 2 individual choices for each of those. Now, the difference between fine, normal, and basic is the image quality. Fine is better quality than normal. Normal is better quality than basic. Also, a JPEG image is a compressed file. Nikon could use one of 2 different algorithms to compress that file. One algorithm will give priority to image quality over image size. Those are the choices with the star. The choices without the star uses an algorithm that gives priority to image size over image quality. So you could choose which one you like. Personally, I shoot exclusively RAW, but for this demonstration, for now I have it set to RAW and JPEG Fine with the star. Next is image size. Now first you could choose the size for your JPEG and TIFF file. And you have large, medium, and small. And this is the size it's going to take up on your memory card, and it will affect the resolution of the image. Now those sizes, 24.3 megapixels, 13.7, and 6.1, that really is the TIFF size. Your JPEGs will be considerably smaller. The RAW files, you have large, medium, and small as well, and those are the sizes for the RAW file. I shoot RAW large, and if I did shoot JPEG, I'd shoot large as well and TIFF. Now the actual RAW recording, you have different compressions for the RAW file. First of all, you could choose no compression at all. So the RAW file gets saved to the card. It's going to be the largest file possible, right? But if you want to use a smaller file, you have two compression options. In the middle, you have just compressed. So that uses an algorithm to compress the RAW file. For that file to be read by, let's say, Lightroom or Photoshop or any other RAW processor you have, it will have to decompress that compressed file. If you choose this middle choice, it's not 100% reversible. So your software, Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever, is going to have to interpolate some of the data. On the other hand, if you choose that top option, it's lossless compressed. It will use an algorithm that is 100% reversible. That's what I choose to use. It will make a smaller file, so it takes up less space, but it's 100% reversible. The downside is it will take Lightroom, Photoshop. The review on the back of your camera takes a little longer to read it, that's all. Next is the bit depth of the RAW file. This mainly has to do with the colors, the color depth. 14-bit gives you more colors than 12-bit, and that's what I use. It's going to give you a larger file, though, too. At the bottom, we have ISO sensitivity settings. Now, you could set your ISO with the ISO button and command wheel on your camera. You could do it in the menu, too, so you could come in here and just set your ISO. Currently, I have it set to ISO 100. You also could set your ISO sensitivity control, your auto ISO sensitivity control. Now again, you could do that with the ISO button in your sub-command dial on your camera, but you could do it in this in the menu system as well. So if you turn that on, then you have some options. First of all, the maximum sensitivity that you want your camera to choose. There may be a situation where anything above ISO 8000 is unusable. So you want to make sure you stay below ISO 8000. So maybe you'll choose ISO 6400. That way the camera will not choose an ISO that is any higher than 6400. Independently, you could choose that same option with a flash. So I have it set to 400. The minimum shutter speed, you could dial in the minimum shutter speed you want your camera to use. I have it set to auto because most of my lenses are CPU lenses that communicate to the camera. So the camera knows what focal length I'm using. So it will make sure I don't use a shutter speed that is too slow for the specific focal length I'm using. If you're using a lens that doesn't have a CPU in it, you could come in here and put in the exact shutter speed you don't want your camera to go below. I suggest you use 1 over the focal length as a rule. So if you have a 300mm lens, for example, dial in something so that your camera does not use below 1/300th of a second. Now 1/300th of a second isn't a choice, so you could choose 1/320th of a second. So 1 over focal length usually works very well. I use auto because all the lenses I use have CPUs, but to tell you the truth, normally I don't use auto ISO, I have that set off. At the top, now we have white balance. You have 3 different auto white balance settings. 0 will reduce the warmth so your whites stay white. 1 will keep the overall atmosphere. So if it was really warm, your whites will look warm. If it's really cool, your whites will look cool. On the other hand, auto 2 will make sure everything's warm. It'll always be warm no matter what, even if the settings or if the scene was really cool. It will keep things warm. So I choose auto 1. You also could just dial in the exact white balance you want, be it direct sunlight, cloudy shade, incandescent, fluorescent, or flash. So if it's cloudy, you could choose cloudy. Now I gotta mention real quick, this really only applies to your JPEG or TIFF, because you could easily switch any of this in post-production if you're shooting RAW. But this setting, if you choose cloudy, it gets baked into the JPEG or TIFF. You could change your white balance in post still, but it's a little more difficult to do. So if you shoot JPEG or TIFF, make sure you have the right white balance. If you shoot RAW, it's not as big of a deal because you could easily adjust this in post-production. You also could choose the actual Kelvin color temperature. So if you're shooting with a specific type of light that maybe is 5,200 Kelvin, you could come in here and dial that right in directly here. Very easily do that. There's also, you could get a preset white balance, a custom white balance. And I'm going to do an individual separate video on how to do that. It's very easy to do, and many times you want to do a custom white balance. But again, a lot of that really only matters if you shoot JPEG or TIFF, because they get baked into the JPEG or TIFF. This is easily changed with a RAW file in post. Next is picture control. This is the profiles that are built into your camera. We have auto, standard, neutral, vivid, chrome or monochrome, portrait, landscape, flat. Then we have 20 creative picture controls, dream, morning, pop, and so on. There's 20 of those. Now, again, these are more critical if you shoot JPEG or TIFF. If you shoot RAW, you could change these in post very easily. If you shoot JPEG, you could still change them, but it's a little different. If you shoot RAW and you're shooting, let's say, to the standard profile, and in post you want to change it to the vivid profile, what it will do is it will actually remove the standard profile from the RAW file and apply the vivid profile to the RAW file. Conversely, if you shoot a JPEG and you shoot the JPEG to the standard profile, that gets baked into that JPEG. Then in post, if you try to switch to the vivid profile, it really lays that on top of the standard profile. So you could change it, but it's different. I just, keep that in mind if you shoot JPEG or TIFF. Now next, you could actually manage those actual individual picture profiles. They call it the picture controls. You could come in here and let's say your vivid is just a little too vivid. You could choose Manage Picture Controls, scroll down to Vivid, then go in and you could actually readjust sharpening, clarity, contrast, brightness, saturation for this specific vivid picture control, or as I like to call them, profiles. So you could do that for all of them, including these creative ones down here as well. You could do that too. And again, that's still more applicable if you shoot JPEG or TIFF exclusively. Next is color space. These are the actual colors that will be available. This is really only applicable to JPEG and TIFF, because if you shoot RAW, every pixel is recorded to the RAW file. Every color is recorded as is. And in post-production, when you export the image, you pick your color profile that you want to use. The color space here is really just for your preview on the back of your camera or what gets baked into your JPEG or TIFF. So this is more applicable for you if you shoot JPEG or TIFF. Adobe RGB is a larger color space. It uses more colors. More colors are available. Unfortunately, not all monitors could reproduce all the colors in the Adobe RGB color space. If that's the case, the monitor will interpolate and use a different color, something that's close. Conversely, sRGB is a smaller color space, and those colors are usually on most monitors reproducible. So if you want to use either one, it's up to you. I use Adobe RGB. Active DLighting is a proprietary Nikon function that helps your camera be able to reproduce high dynamic range scenes. A scene with high dynamic range has a lot of very bright areas, a lot of midtones, and a lot of very dark areas. A lot of times a camera's exposure latitude cannot capture that entire range of tone. Well, with active DLighting, it helps it capture it. I have it set off. I don't use it. But if you're photographing a high dynamic range scene, it may help your image along if you choose either extra high, high, normal, low, or if you prefer, just use auto. If you use auto, the camera will analyze the scene and use high, extra high, normal, low as it sees fit. Again, I mentioned I don't use it. It's really up to you how it works. Try it, see if you like active DLighting. It's kind of like HDR in theory, but it doesn't give you that HDR look at all. It's like a normal image. Long exposure noise reduction. If you take a very long exposure, the sensor is going to be energized over that entire time. And what happens often, because it has electricity flowing through it that entire time, it will produce noise. If you have this set to on, the camera will automatically reduce that noise. But the way it does it is it will double your exposure. For example, if you take a 3-minute exposure, it will take your 3-minute exposure, then it will stop that exposure, then it will immediately take a second 3-minute exposure with the shutter curtain down. So it's taking a blank picture for 3 minutes. So what it does is it keeps that sensor energized for another 3 minutes with the curtain down. Then it looks at this, what should be a black blank picture, and sees where the noise is and uses that as a reference to remove noise on the actual exposure. So throughout that 6-minute period, you will not be able to use your camera. So it works well, but it does tie up your camera a long time. So I have it set off. High ISO noise reduction. If you use a higher ISO, it will help reduce noise. You have 4 choices: off, low, normal, and high. I keep mine on normal. I do use that. Vignette control. Some lenses will vignette, and the camera could compensate for that. You could have that set to high, normal, low, or off. I keep it on normal. If you have a lens you know does not vignette at all, you could turn that off. It really doesn't hurt one way or another, tell you the truth. Diffraction compensation. You've probably heard about lens diffraction before. That's the effect you get if you stop down the lens too much. So it is recommended that a lens that use an aperture that is no more than 2 to 4 stops closed down from wide open. On most lenses, that would be f8 to f11. If you stop it down any more than that, what will happen is you'll get this diffraction happening, and the lens will not, the pixels won't be as crisp and clear, basically. So, for example, if you shoot at f22, you'll have a lot of depth of field, but your pixels won't be as resolute. And that's because of diffraction. Well, with this camera, it could compensate for that. So you could use a smaller aperture. I have mine set to on. Auto distortion control, you can see, is grayed out. You need to have a CPU lens that has auto distortion control built in. If it does, then you could go in here and switch it on or off. I don't have a lens currently that has auto distortion control, so that's grayed out. Flicker reduction shooting. Incandescent and fluorescent lights will flicker 60 hertz or 50 hertz depending on where in the world you are. And because of that flicker, if you're taking a picture, one picture to the next might be lighter or darker because it's catching that flicker at the wrong time. With flicker reduction shooting, that helps compensate for that, so your exposures are more even. I have that set to on. Lots of different options for metering. You have matrix metering, which uses the entire scene, scientifically analyzes it, and chooses an exposure it sees fit to expose that entire scene. Center weighted metering puts more priority on the center of the frame. So whatever is in the middle, it will use that as reference more so than the rest of the frame. It still uses the entire frame, but references the center a little more. Spot metering is wherever your focus point is, that's where it's going to meter. That's what I use. Highlight weighted metering still uses the focus point as a reference for metering, but it also takes into account the brightest area of the scene, and it will make sure that that bright area is not blown out. I choose spot metering. Flash control, that is grayed out because you need to have on your camera either the wireless remote, the WR-R10 remote flash control on your camera, or you need one of the flashes that has that built in. I don't, so there, if it was, you could control your flashes from there. Flash mode, you have a number of different options here. First of all, you have fill flash, that's what I use, just want to illuminate the scene with my flash. If you have a person in the scene, you may want to choose red eye reduction. You could have if you're using a slow sync with a person in the scene, so a very slow shutter speed, you would use that option. Just slow sync without a person. Rear curtain sync, that again is a slower exposure where you're going to be recording blur, but you want the flash to occur at the end of the exposure so it looks more natural. So if someone is moving left to right, they're not as dark, or not as bright as they're moving left to right. Then at the end of the exposure, they get frozen in time, so it looks more natural. Or you could have the flash off. I just have it on fill flash mostly. Flash compensation, you could change the compensation, just hit the little down arrows. You could go down in 1/3 stop increments or up in 1/3 stop increments, as you can see. And focus mode, you have 3 different focus mode. AF-S, which is single mode. That means you're going to focus on something. Once it achieves focus, it stops. AF-C is continuous focus mode. As long as you hold the shutter button in halfway, or if you're like me and you use back button focusing and you hold that button in, it's always going to be focusing. Wherever your focus point is over, it's always going to be focusing. So moving subject, you'd probably want to use AF-C. Some static subject, AF-S. Or you could just manually focus. I use both the AF-S and AF-C a lot. I use AF-C probably more than AF-S. Next we have the AF area mode, and there's a number of different choices here. Pinpoint AF will only be available if you're shooting the AF-S focus mode. When you're in AF-S focus mode, you could choose Pinpoint AF, and it's going to be using the smallest focus point available, but it only uses the contrast detection focus points, so it tends to be a little slower and less accurate. On the other hand, Single Point AF, the next choice, uses all the focus points, contrast detect and phase detect, and it tends to be faster and more accurate, but it's a bit larger, so it's not as small as Pinpoint AF. Below that, you'll see Dynamic Area AF, and that's grayed out. The reason why that's grayed out is that only works in the AF-C focus mode. I recommend you use Dynamic Area AF if you're shooting a subject that is erratically moving or moving quickly through a scene. So you'll have your camera in AF-C focus mode, and you'll be focusing on, say, a bird flying through the scene. Dynamic area will work really well for that. Below that, we have wide area AF, and you have 2 choices actually, a smaller area or a larger area. That's kind of like Single Point AF. It just uses a bigger block of pixels. Use that if you're focusing on something that's relatively large or something moving slowly through the scene, something like that. And you could choose the size that you're using, small or large there. Below that is Auto Area AF. So the camera's going to determine the focus point. I don't like using this because sometimes it's wrong. It's focusing on the wrong thing. For example, let's say you have a cat in a field, and you're focusing and you want to focus on the cat, but if you use Auto Area AF, it may focus on a tree that's to the side of the cat, behind the cat, something like that. So I don't use Auto Area AF. So my recommendations is you use Single Point AF for most of your focusing. You're focusing on a person, a pet, a subject that's, inanimate, whatever. Use Single Point AF. If you're shooting wildlife or sports or something like that, and you're using AF-C focus mode, use dynamic area AF. And those two area modes will work for most everything you need to shoot. Next is vibration reduction. Of course, the Z6 and Z7 have in-body image stabilization. They call it vibration reduction. You could have it off, or you could have it in normal mode or sport mode. And that is exactly what it means. Have it in normal mode for most of your shooting. If you're shooting sports, something moving erratically, or if you have your camera on a gimbal and you're moving it rather quickly, let's say to capture a bird flying through the air, use sport mode. If you have your camera on a tripod, turn it off. It will help focus and take a better image, and it will use less battery life. Auto bracketing, a lot of different choices here, and this gets kind of confusing for a lot of people. Personally, I just bracket my exposures, so I use AE bracketing. You could bracket your flash as well, so you have AE and flash bracketing. That's that first choice. You could just bracket your flash only, if you choose. You could bracket white balance. So you could just bracket your white balance. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. Or you could bracket your active DLighting if you choose to use that. Now, most of us probably bracket exposures. And if you do, you have a number of different choices. You could bracket, let's say, take an image that is properly, at least your camera thinks is properly exposed. And then if you you could go 3 images, 1 image underexposed, 1 image overexposed, 1 image properly exposed, or 5, or 7. And you could see how it will spread out those images with an equal number of images underexposed and an equal number of images overexposed on either side of your properly exposed image. And you could choose the increment that you want. Oh, by the way, you could go to 9. I'm sorry. So you could go from 3 to 9. The increment, you could go from 1/3 of a stop up to 1 stop. So 0.3, 0.7, 1. Then it will go 1 full stop to 2 to 3. So you could go up to 3 stops of separation of those images. There is some limitation you might have noticed when I was at 9 frames and I went anything higher than 1 stop, it would go down to 5 frames. Also, conversely, you could go up here and go the other way. You could go to 2 minus 2. So what that means is you're going to take 1 image that's properly exposed and 1 image that's, whatever your increment is, underexposed. In this case, 1 stop underexposed. You could go plus 2. So you're going to take a properly exposed image, and in this case, 1 image that is 1 stop overexposed. Or you could go to minus 3, which is 2 images that are going to be underexposed at your increment. Or plus 3. Images that are going to be overexposed. So 2 images that are going to be overexposed at your increment again. So you have those choices. Typically, normally if you're just taking normal pictures, you're not going to be bracketing. So you have that off. That's 0F. Next is multiple exposures. You actually could take multiple exposures in camera if you want to. Now, this gets a little confusing to people. You have on a series or on single photo. If you use on single photo, you'll take your multiple exposure, and once it's done, it's done. From that point on, it will automatically switch to normal picture taking. On the other hand, if you have it on series, you turn it on and it will always be on until you come into this menu to turn it off. So let's say you choose on single photo. Now you could choose the number of shots you want to use in your multiple exposure. Let's say you're choosing 2. You could change that here. You could just go up and choose up to 10 shots. So let's say we're choosing 2. Now the overlay mode, how do you want to blend those 2 images? There's a number of different choices. It kind of is different depending on the scene, depending on your images. Most often you're using average, but you could try the other choices to see how they work for you. Keep all exposures. So you're going to take 2 shots. Let's say you take a shot of your cat, then you take a shot of a field. So your multiple exposure will be of your cat in the field, basically. Well, you're taking those 2 shots, then the camera's going to create the 3rd shot. So if you keep all exposures, you're going to keep all 3 images, right? If you have that off, you're only going to keep the merged image, the image of the cat in the field. Overlay shooting. So you take that first image of your cat. Then you frame the scene of the grass field. In the viewfinder, you'll see very lightly the image of your cat overlaid, so it helps you frame the scene. And that's what that does. So you could do, I mean, if you're into it, I'm not into multiple exposures, but it does work pretty well. And you could check that out. Now you'll notice that high dynamic range is grayed out. You know, some of these are grayed out. This has to do a lot with the settings that are already set. For example, with high dynamic range, that only works with JPEGs. So to get that to work, I would have to go up to image quality and set that only to JPEG. Once it's set to JPEG, I could come down here and go to eventually, where was it? Oh, there it is, high dynamic range. And then I could come in here and I could do the HDR mode. Now again, you have a single photo. So this middle one, it's going to do your HDR however you have it set up, and then it's going to turn itself off. And then from that point on, you're going to be in regular picture taking mode. On the other hand, if you turn it on here, it's going to stay on, and you'll always be shooting HDR shots until you come in here to physically just come in here and turn this off. Now, if you have it on, either one, you have the exposure differential, either how many stops difference do you want between each exposure. Auto, 1, 2, or 3 stops. Smoothing, it helps make the image look more natural, low, normal, or high. If you're having a scene with, let's say it's outside and it's windy out, you may want to have high smoothing because the tree movement and things like that, you want those smoothed out. People moving through the scenes. If it's a static scene, you could have that on low, whatever works best. Save those individual images. Again, if you're taking a number of HDR images, it will save them to all of them to the memory card plus your merged image if you have that set to on. Now I don't shoot HDR in camera, but if I did, it would work. It would work out pretty well. Below that is interval timer shooting. This allows you to take a number of images over a given length of time. First of all, you would choose your starting day and time. Then the interval. It's set to an hour right now, so it's going to take a number of images over that interval. How many shots per interval do you want to take? And you would change that there. So you could change your shots per interval there. Exposure smoothing. Again, this kind of makes it look more natural. You could have that on or off. Silent photography. We're going to get to it in a minute. The camera has an electronic shutter available. Instead of having the shutter curtain move up and down and make that click noise, you'll have the ability to use a silent shutter, electronic shutter, and then it won't make any noise when it does it. And then, let's see, you could do the interval priority. This one thing I should point out, and I didn't, in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that little question mark there. If you ever wonder what something means, you could just click on that little question mark and it will give you an idea what it does. Now, it's not available for everything. Now, as far as interval priority, as it's going over this long length of time, taking this interval timer shot, if you give it priority to the interval, it's going to make sure that it shoots those images at the exact interval. On the other hand, if you turn that off, it's going to give priority to the actual exposure. So it's going to make sure that the exposure is bright. And you could read it all about here. And choose manual focus. And when using auto ISO. So you could read through here of what it prioritizes exposure, as you can see there. So that is interval timer shooting. Next is Timelapse Movie. That is interval timer shooting, but then the camera will make a movie out of all those images. You can see that's grayed out because another setting I have in the camera has that disabled. So I'm not actually sure what setting I have set right now that is disabling Timelapse Movie. It could be a lot of things. It could be my focus area mode. You might have to choose something like that. No, that didn't do it. It could be a lot of things. Could be. So you'd have to come in and try different options. And if I figure out what that is, in the description below this video, I'll write down why Timelapse Movie is grayed out in my case. Focus shift shooting. This is particularly true if you're shooting macros. You may have very limited depth of field, and you'll focus stack images so that you have more of the scene in focus. You could do all this in camera. You would come in here and you would pick the number of shots you want to take, the focus step width. You could come in here and change this from a very narrow width to a very wide width. Of course, the more narrow you go, it's going to really just kind of refocus very slightly as it focuses out. On the other hand, if you go wide, it's going to focus a little bit more out. So, you know, you experiment with that. There's no written rule here. The interval until the next shot. How long do you want to wait between shots? If you have it set to 0, it's going to immediately take all shots all at once. First frame exposure lot. When it takes that first image, it's going to gain an exposure setting for that first image. If you have this set to on, it's going to use that same exposure setting for all the images. You probably want that on. You could have that off though if you think it would work better. Peaking stack image, I can't remember what that is, so I'm going to hit the thing. During focus shift photography, combine the peaking information from each frame into a single image to display during playback. That is having to do with the actual tone, I think, of the image, I think. So kind of, I guess, evens the tones if you have that on. I'm guessing. To tell you the truth, I'm not 100% sure on that. I've used focus shift shooting once with my Nikon D850, and it worked okay. And that peaking stack image setting is not there on the Nikon D850, as I remember. Now, silent photography, you could use the electronic shutter, so your image won't be clicking, or your camera won't be clicking the shutter open and close for each image. And you might want that on. It might work better if you have that on. And you could choose what folder to store these images in. And next, and finally, is silent photography. That's the electronic shutter. You could turn that on, and you'll be taking images, and the shutter will not have to open and close, making that noise. So that is, for better or worse, the entire photo shooting menu. I mentioned this one's going to be the longest one. In our next episode, we're going to jump down to the custom setting menu, and I'm going to do A, B, and C of this menu in that video. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. Please like and share the video. Visit my website, IamMrPhotographer.com, and my photography how-to video website, OnlinePhotographyTraining.com. Thank you.